The afternoon I was terminated, just minutes after finalizing a deal worth nearly $4 million, was the exact moment I realized my accomplishments would never measure up in that man's eyes. It was a gray Thursday in a conference room that still carried the faint scent of the celebratory champagne from the client's signing. 6 months of my life had gone into that negotiation. Countless flights, sleepless nights, and strategy sessions that bled into weekends, all to convince a hesitant international investor to commit to our firm over 2 aggressive competitors. The ink was barely dry on the contract when I stepped into the hallway, my hands still trembling with the adrenaline of victory. I had just delivered the most significant contract our division had seen in over 2 years. But before I could even reach my desk, my boss, Mr. Davenport, materialized in my doorway. He wore that tight, rehearsed smile he always deployed when he was about to deliver bad news disguised as professionalism. "Samantha," he said, his voice clipped. "Let's talk in the conference room." My stomach tightened instantly. I followed him back inside, bracing myself for a lecture about protocol or an approval process I'd bypassed. Instead, he shut the door, folded his arms, and fixed me with a look that felt like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire career. "I'm going to have to let you go," he stated. I blinked, the words not making sense. "What? We just secured the Hartman account." He waved a hand dismissively. "That's hardly the point, Sarah." He paused, then corrected himself. "Samantha, you're just not the right fit for our trajectory anymore." He'd fumbled my name. He couldn't even be bothered to get it right while firing me. "I just brought in a multi-million-dollar contract," I said, forcing my voice to remain level. "How am I not the right fit?" He shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. "You're volatile, you're difficult to manage, a liability. It's not just about the numbers, Samantha." A liability. That word echoed in my head. I understood then with a chilling clarity that my achievements were irrelevant. In his eyes, I was still the intern who challenged outdated systems, the junior analyst who asked too many questions, the woman who pushed for change instead of following orders. He didn't want competence. He wanted compliance, and I had never been compliant. So I stood there silent as he slid a termination packet across the polished table as if he were passing a menu. "HR will see you out," he said, escorted, like I was a security risk. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, gathered my few personal items, and walked past coworkers who stared at their screens, relieved it wasn't them. Outside, the cold wind was a shock. I stood on the sidewalk, clutching a small succulent from my desk and an award I'd won just 3 months prior, thinking, he will never see my worth. In that instant, something hardened inside me. Not from bitterness, but from a stark, cold realization. If they defined me as a failure, I would build a life where their definition no longer applied. The following months were a quiet period of reconstruction. I took consulting work for smaller firms, utilizing the same negotiation tactics Davenport had labeled as too aggressive. Outside of his office, those tactics were gold. Within 6 months, I had a steady roster of clients. Within 9, I had launched my own boutique advisory firm, specializing in ethical tech and educational nonprofits, the kind of meaningful projects my old company never touched. I didn't hear a word from anyone at my former job. Not Davenport, not HR, not the team I had carried. I might as well have vanished. That is, until exactly 1 year later. I was in Chicago, preparing to give a keynote at a major innovation conference. I'd been selected to receive a national award for sustainable business strategy, a prize funded annually by a private donor who stayed anonymous. I never thought much about the benefactor. That's how awards work. But the night I walked into the ballroom, wearing a navy dress purchased with my first consulting check, the announcer's words stopped me cold. "This year's $2 million research grant is funded by a special contributor, Davenport Industries." My old company. My old boss's firm, the man who had called me a failure. My first thought was it had to be a coincidence. He couldn't possibly know I was the honoree. He probably didn't even remember my name. Then, as the audience applauded, I saw him. Mr. Davenport rose from a VIP table, locked eyes with me, and walked out of the ballroom. No nod, no forced smile, Just a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if being forced to fund my success was the final insult of his career. And in that moment, I knew this story was far from over. Seeing him flee the ceremony snapped everything into focus. I had expected shock, maybe awkwardness. But this, a CEO, a grown man, storming out because the recipient of his own company's charitable grant was the woman he'd fired. I stood on stage, smiling for the cameras, but my mind was racing. Why that reaction? What was he so afraid of? What was he hiding? I delivered my prepared speech, thanking the committee, outlining my plans for the grant. My voice was steady, but my focus was on the door he'd disappeared through. When the ceremony ended, I slipped into the hallway. The noise of the ballroom faded, replaced by the sterile hum of hotel corridors. I scanned the area, expecting to see him arguing with someone, packing, anything. He was gone, vanished. I didn't follow him, not then. I returned to the ballroom, accepted congratulations, smiled for photos, but I wasn't there. I was replaying his expression. The disgust wasn't just shock, it was personal. Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I placed the award statue on the desk. Its polished surface gleamed under the lamp. A year ago, I never would have imagined standing in a Chicago ballroom, accepting an award funded by the company that threw me away. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. If he wouldn't talk, I would find out what had been happening at Davenport Industries since I left. The first red flag was immediate. Company performance had dropped 14%. Major client loss, Hartman Group. My stomach lurched. The very account I had secured. After my termination, it must have been reassigned, and whoever took over had lost it. Losing a contract that size wasn't a minor setback. It would have forced the board to ask some very difficult questions. Questions that might trace back to the decision to fire me. I stared at the report, the implications dawning. Had Hartman pulled out because I was gone, or had internal mismanagement pushed them away? Either way, the aftermath was clearly a disaster. I kept digging. More articles surfaced, falling revenue, a sudden reshuffling of executive roles. Investor scrutiny. Then, the headline that made my blood run cold. Davenport Industries faces internal audit amid anonymous compliance concerns. A compliance audit. That suggested financial irregularities, ethical breaches, something that could destroy a company's reputation. The timing was perfect, just months after I left, but it wasn't the audit that shook me. It was the funding trail for my award. Davenport Industries had pledged the donation 8 months prior, long before nominations were announced. It was a standard philanthropic budget move designed to polish their image. So yes, the company funded the award. But Davenport himself clearly never expected me to be the recipient. That explained his reaction, but not the intensity. Something deeper was going on. The next morning, I flew back to Boston. On the plane, I replayed a detail I'd missed. When my name was announced, several executives at the VIP table looked not impressed, but startled, as if they knew something about Davenport Industries, something about me. I spent the weekend poring over everything: corporate filings, public legal memos, project timelines. What I found wasn't a smoking gun. It was worse. After I left, my replacement had signed off on a strategy model built on my work, my research, my proprietary framework, the same framework I had developed independently after leaving. It wasn't illegal. They'd altered it just enough to make it legally untraceable. But they'd made a mistake. I had the original files. I had the timestamps. I closed my laptop and leaned back, a slow realization crystallizing. He wasn't angry because I succeeded. He was angry because my success was a spotlight, threatening to expose something he had buried deep inside his own company. For the first time since the night I was fired, I understood. I wasn't the liability. I was the danger. For days, I felt like I was circling a truth I couldn't quite grasp. The documents showed sloppy strategy, inconsistent reporting, and a collapse in oversight. But those were symptoms. Something else had infected Davenport Industries long before I left. The rot ran deeper than I knew. The turning point came the following Tuesday with an unexpected email. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk, it's about Davenport." The sender made my heart skip. Lena Correa, my replacement, we had never met. She'd been hired a week after I was fired, but I'd heard her name whispered in industry circles, sharp, ambitious, polished. The kind of hire Davenport loved, unlikely to challenge him. I opened the message. Samantha, you don't know me, but I've been following your work. Congratulations on the award. I'm reaching out because something is wrong here, something serious. And I think you already know part of it. If you're open to it, we should meet somewhere private. Lena. My first instinct was suspicion. My second was curiosity. If Davenport wasn't talking, maybe the woman who replaced me was finally seeing the trap she'd walked into. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our cities. I arrived early, my nerves buzzing. When Lena walked in, I recognized her instantly from LinkedIn, poised, sharply dressed. But today, her confidence was cracked. "Thank you for coming," she said, sliding into the booth. I didn't know who else to contact. "What's going on?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. "I made a huge mistake joining Davenport Industries, a huge one." I leaned forward. "Define mistake." Her fingers wrapped tight around her coffee cup. "I was brought in to manage the accounts you used to handle. At first, everything seemed fine. Then I started noticing things. Financial projections that didn't match client data, internal memos contradicting official reports, compliance flags being dismissed without review. It aligned with what I'd seen, but it wasn't new." "And the Hartman Group," I pressed. "Why did they really pull out?" Her eyes darted to mine. "That's the thing, they didn't pull out, we did." I froze. "What?" "I wasn't told at the time, but I found the file last month. Davenport terminated the contract, intentionally." I stared at her, the information not computing. Terminated a $3.7 million deal. No company cuts off its own revenue unless the risk of keeping it outweighs the reward. "What risk?" I demanded. Lena swallowed. "The strategies used in the Hartman pitch, your strategies, they were too effective. The projections showed that if those systems were implemented, Hartman would eventually outpace Davenport Industries in market influence." It hit me like a physical blow. Davenport hadn't wanted brilliance. He wanted control. He didn't fire me because I was incompetent. He fired me because he saw the threat of someone who could outperform him. But Lena wasn't finished. "That's not the worst part," she said. "Your framework, the original version you created before you left, I've seen pieces of it copied into internal documents. Pitch decks, compliance reports, investor packets, they've been using it everywhere." My pulse skyrocketed. "That's impossible. They didn't have access to my updated research." She nodded. "Exactly. Which means someone inside has been patching together older versions of your work and presenting it as internal development. It's being treated as proprietary." The anger that surged through me was nothing like the hurt I'd felt when I was fired. This was cleaner, sharper. A violation, not an insult. I forced myself to breathe. "Why are you telling me all this?" She looked away, ashamed. "Because last week compliance finally came knocking. They requested files I'd never even seen. The internal audit is underway, and from what I've heard, they're looking for someone to blame, someone expendable, someone like me." "You think they'll pin it on you?" I said quietly. "Yes," she whispered. "But the truth is, this started long before I came. And I think you're the only person who understands the full picture." I didn't respond right away. I stared at this woman who had unknowingly stepped into the chaos I'd left behind. And for the first time, I saw exactly how my revenge would begin. Not with anger, but with precision. "Lena," I said finally, "I'm going to help you, but you need to do exactly what I tell you." Her eyes widened. "You have a plan?" I nodded, the strategy locking into place. "Oh, yes, and it starts with Davenport learning he fired the wrong woman." Over the next week, Lena and I spoke every evening. She sent me documents, internal emails, audit requests. Nothing illegal, just files she had access to as part of her role. I analyzed everything, not to expose the company yet, but to understand what we were dealing with. The deeper we went, the clearer the picture became. Davenport hadn't just mismanaged his division. He had built an entire system around avoidance, dodging accountability, redirecting credit, manipulating audits, and silencing dissent. I had never realized how much of his authority came from intimidation rather than competence. But now, he was cornered. The internal audit had uncovered irregularities. The board was demanding extensive documentation. That gave us a window, small, but enough to apply pressure where it belonged. My goal wasn't to destroy Davenport Industries. It was to expose the truth, that the person he'd fired for being below standards had been carrying the department for years, and without my work, his operation was unraveling. The first step was simple. "Lena," I said during a call, "I need you to request clarification on every strategy document tied to the Hartman account." She hesitated. "Won't that make me look like I don't understand my own files?" "No, it'll make you look thorough, and it forces the audit team to examine the timeline. Once they see the gaps, the inconsistencies in authorship where the strategy came from, they'll realize the foundation wasn't built by you, or by Davenport." She nodded slowly. "And when they ask who created the original version, they'll find my name," I said, "because it's on every time-stamped file I drafted before I left." It wasn't revenge. It was accuracy. And accuracy was something Davenport had avoided for years. 2 days later, Lena followed through. She sent a detailed inquiry to the auditing team, copying 3 executives and the head of compliance. Within hours, compliance replied, asking for all earlier versions of the strategy. Versions she didn't have. That was exactly what we needed, because the only earlier versions existed on the shared drive from before I was fired. Those files contained my name. The next morning, Lena messaged me. "They pulled the earliest drafts. Your signature is all over them. Davenport is panicking." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Later that afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. A calm male voice said, "Dr. Palmer, this is Elijah Brooks, Senior Counsel for Davenport Industries. Do you have a moment to speak?" My pulse didn't spike. I had expected this. "Yes." He cleared his throat. "We are reviewing documents related to legacy strategy frameworks. Your name appears frequently in material currently under audit. We would like to confirm the nature of your involvement and whether you retain any ownership claims regarding the methodology." His tone was polite, but I could hear the caution underneath. "I developed that framework independently," I said. "The company used earlier variations while I was employed, but I did not transfer rights to any updated versions created after my departure." A pause, long enough to confirm he already knew this. "Thank you, your cooperation is appreciated." He hung up quickly, too quickly. Lena called 5 minutes later. "He ran straight to Davenport's office. I didn't hear everything, but the board wants an emergency meeting tomorrow. They're not happy." Of course they were. The company's flagship sustainability strategy, the one they'd promoted to investors, to partners, to the media, was built on my work. And the person Davenport had blamed for the department's failures was now the person whose absence had crippled them. I didn't want the company to collapse. People's jobs were at stake. Lena's future was at stake. This wasn't about scorched earth. It was about precision. So we planned the next step. "Tomorrow," I told her, "you're going to attend the board meeting, and you're going to tell the truth. Calmly, professionally, just facts, no accusations." She swallowed. "And if Davenport tries to blame me?" "Then the board will compare the quality of your work to the mess he created, and they'll see exactly what's been happening." For the first time, she exhaled with real relief. "I can do that." That night, as I reviewed the documents one last time, something unexpected happened. I realized I felt nothing for the man who had humiliated me. No anger, no grief, no desire for validation. He had built the collapse of his own credibility, brick by brick. I was simply illuminating the cracks. The next morning, Lena sent one final message before entering the boardroom. "Whatever happens in there, thank you for not walking away." I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back. "This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about truth. Go show them what he tried to hide." And with that, the trap closed. Lena entered the boardroom at 9 a.m. By 9:17, my phone was vibrating nonstop. I didn't pick up at first. I let the notifications pile in. One message from her, then another, then a third. I forced myself to breathe before opening them. He's losing control. They're asking questions he can't answer. They know the framework wasn't his idea. I sat back, letting the words sink in. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about clarity finally reaching the place where it had been missing the longest. At 10:03, my phone rang. This time, it was a number I recognized, the chairman of Davenport Industries, a man I'd interacted with only twice during my years there. "Dr. Palmer," he said as soon as I answered. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." He paused long enough for me to hear the tension in his breath. "We're in the middle of reviewing strategic discrepancies related to the sustainability division. Your name appears extensively. We would appreciate your insight." My insight, or my silence? He let out a quiet exhale, not frustration, resignation, your honesty. For the first time in days, I felt something loosen in my chest. They didn't want a scapegoat. They wanted the truth, and they knew exactly who had it. "I'll speak with you," I said, "but on record and only with compliance present." "Of course. In fact, we would prefer it." He scheduled a remote session for the early afternoon. Until then, all I could do was wait. At 2 p.m., the video conference began. 4 faces appeared: the chairman, the legal counsel, the head of compliance, and a board member I vaguely remembered shaking hands with 3 years earlier. What surprised me wasn't their formality. It was their expressions, not anger, concern. "Dr. Palmer," the chairman began, "we understand you were instrumental in developing the original sustainability framework used during the Hartman negotiations." "I was," I said, "and I have the documentation to verify that." "We've seen it," compliance added. "It aligns with the earliest drafts recovered from internal servers." Legal counsel cleared his throat. "We're trying to determine how much of this work was produced under your employment contract and how much was created independently after your departure." "I can provide a clear distinction," I said, lifting a folder. "But the core issue isn't ownership. The issue is misrepresentation." Foreheads lifted slightly. "The company presented my methodology as a fully internal development," I continued. "That was inaccurate. And when decisions were made after my departure, those decisions were based on partial, outdated versions of the model. That's why the Hartman account deteriorated. Not because of negligence from current staff, but because the framework was never meant to be used without the updated components." Silence filled the screen. Finally, the chairman spoke. "This aligns with what Ms. Correa has told us." Lena had told the truth, even when it placed her under scrutiny. It was more courage than I'd ever seen inside that building. The legal counsel looked uneasy. "Dr. Palmer, we need to ask directly. Do you intend to pursue action against the company for the use of your intellectual property?" A year ago, I might have. Not for revenge, but for dignity. But now I didn't need anything from them. They had already handed me the one thing I never got while working there: acknowledgement. "No," I said. "I want nothing from Davenport Industries. I simply want the record corrected, and I expect Ms. Correa to be cleared of responsibility." Compliance nodded immediately. "She will be." "And," I added, "I want assurance that the board understands the truth about why the sustainability division failed after my departure." The chairman leaned forward. "We do," he said very clearly. He dismissed the meeting shortly after, thanking me for my professionalism. But the final blow didn't come from the board, or compliance, or legal counsel. It came an hour later in the form of an email. Subject: Leadership Transition Announcement. The message was brief. "Effective immediately, Andrew Davenport has resigned from his position as CEO of Davenport Industries. An interim leadership team has been appointed as the board continues its audit and restructuring process." No theatrics, no excuses, just the quiet end of a man who had built his authority on intimidation and watched it evaporate the moment facts replaced fear. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in watching someone fall, but there was closure. Later that evening, Lena called me. "They removed him from the building. Security escorted him out, the same way he once escorted you." Her voice was soft, Not triumphant, not malicious, just relieved. "What will you do now?" I asked. "Stay," she said, "and rebuild the department the right way." I smiled. "Good, they'll need someone competent." "And you?" she asked. I looked around my office, at the files for my own thriving firm, at the award on my shelf. "I already built what I needed," I said, "and I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." When I hung up, the quiet in my home felt different. Not empty, not heavy, just free. The man who once called me a failure had funded the award that elevated my career. And the system he used to belittle me had finally crumbled under the weight of the truth. I didn't ruin him. He did that himself. All I did was stop cleaning up his mess.